In Orpheus's hands, music changed the world. His lyre rendered ravenous lions and tigers docile. Animals flocked to him, entranced by his song. In mythology's first battle of the bands, Orpheus outperformed the notorious sirens, dispelling their alluring melody with his own. Trees, rocks, and rivers drew nearer to hear his singing, and his dulcet tones stilled the raging seas. Orpheus epitomizes the power of music to impact the human heart and the external world, offering an apt mythic parallel to the power of music to affect meaning, interactivity, and interpretation in video games. Building on Johann Heisinger's Homo Ludens, Eric Zimmerman and Katie Salen coined the evocative term magic circle to describe a discrete play context from which new meanings emerge, combining elements intrinsic and extrinsic to the game. Within a magic circle, the rules of ordinary life are temporarily suspended so that mundane actions are imbued with newfound significance in the game world. A game's magic circle is not impenetrable. It is distinct from ordinary life but not hermetically sealed off from it. Rather, the boundary between game world and ordinary life is like a porous cellular membrane, traversed by players who routinely bridge the two domains. Contrary to its critics, the magic circle is remarkably flexible, adaptable, and permeable. Disagreement over the nature of the magic circle sparked video game studies' most formative controversy, ludology versus narratology. It is no great exaggeration to describe academics as addicted to debates over terminology. Most academic disciplines have been shaped by such discussions, including video game scholarship. Described by one participant as a blood feud between two entrenched camps, the debate between ludology and narratology probes foundational questions about what video games are and how they should be understood. Broadly speaking, ludologists hold that video games should be analyzed primarily, first, or only as games, while narratologists believe examining them as a storytelling medium is also productive. Largely occurring in academic conferences and publications from the late 1990s to the mid-2000s, the quarrel already seems a bit passé. However, revisiting this fundamental discourse clarifies the stakes within game studies. Are ludic and narrative components of video games complementary, or are they different structures that are in effect doing opposite things? And how do game and story each relate to music? Ludological perspectives emphasize gameplay-related components of a video game, such as programming or rules. Ludologists' main concerns may be summarized as follows. A distinct academic field studying games as games is necessary. Video games' most unique characteristics relate to gameplay, not narrative. Theoretical frameworks imported wholesale from other disciplines are a poor fit for analyzing games. Overall, ludologists sought to maintain focus on what made video games distinct and unique. Narratologists affirmed that, while video games are unique in affording gameplay, they may also convey narrative. Narratologists' points may also be grouped into three main concerns. Although video games are not reducible to narrative, most do constitute narratives. Ludologists' critiques of video games operate on too narrow a conception of narrative. Narrative is a major driver of players' immersion and interest in video games. Overall, narratologists call attention to commonalities between video games and other artistic media, seeking to adapt analytical frameworks from other disciplines in productive ways. It should be clear that ludology and narratology are compatible. Video games possess unique properties as well as similarities to other art forms. From the start, the ludology-narratology debate was premised on a false dichotomy. Ludomusicology, the study of video game music, must chart a third course between these two poles to evade the perils of the past. Reflecting on the debate a decade later, Michalis Kokonis proposes semiotics as an umbrella concept encompassing study of gameplay and narrative, as well as visual aesthetics, music, and modes of interactivity. Presenting players with multiple simultaneous streams of visual, aural, verbal, haptic, and cognitive information to decode, playing a video game is one of the most complex multimodal semiotic feats available. Günter Kress writes that a multimodal approach assumes that all modes of representation are, in principle, of equal significance in representation and communication. In other words, video game music constructs and communicates meaning comparable to its story, graphics, or gameplay. It is time to move beyond the reductionist game narrative binary into a rich kaleidoscope of multimodal meaning. Video game players and observers alike may be tempted to view a game's soundtrack as mere background music, not worth actively listening to while focusing on the gameplay. However, this overlooks video game music's immense potential to frame, shape, and nuance the game's narrative and thematic elements, and the meaning-making processes of play. Ludo musicologists deny that game music is merely sonic wallpaper or that it possesses less artistic merit than concert or film music. Tim Summers boldly ascribes music greater aesthetic priority and a larger role in video games than in film, citing interactivity as a distinguishing factor. In the context of ludomusicology, interactivity typically refers to music or sound design that is triggered or modified by the player's gameplay actions. In Playing with Sound, Karen Collins theorizes interactive video game sound as the sonification of human action, where the player initiates an event and there is a system-controlled sonic response. The interactivity between player and game is bidirectional, as sound informs subsequent gameplay actions. We move to the music, and the music moves us, Collins concludes, which changes the way that we hear that music. In other words, interactive game audio is not only ludically significant, but semiotically significant. Semiotic play is central to the experience of game sound, inviting players into a game within a game, encouraging them to manipulate the musical score through gameplay actions. Each player's musical journey will be as unique as their choices, reflecting the player's individual identity. Every player choice is an interpretive act that reconstitutes the game world's soundscape around that action. The magic circle has no closed border, but a membrane permeable by the outside world. Orpheus's legacy finds its fulfillment in video game soundtracks. Through players' meaning-making agency, music truly can change its world. The only prior ludomusicology publication with explicit, extensive treatment of ludology and narratology is Julian Grasso's account of ludo-musical narrativity, or ludonarrative, seeking to reconcile ludic and narrative priorities by focusing on the interactivity of video game music. Analyzing Journey as a case study, Grasso demonstrates that interactive music often encodes narrative structures discovered through gameplay. Surrounded by a vast, infinite desert, Journey's initial soundtrack presents only a mixture of white noise and drone tones until the player interacts with certain objects which activate musical fragments, providing a sense of progression. If players linger too long without activating the next objective, these layers fade, returning the soundscape to a sonic wash. Maintaining the music's flow and development requires progressing through the game, but there is no cue besides the music to prompt players to do so. The implied musical teleology narrativizes play through its own forms of progression. Interactive music, together with players' music semiotic preferences and expectations, gives narrative significance to gameplay actions. Grasso's persuasive account of ludonarrative lands quite near my own, yet I further her insights in two crucial ways. First, Grasso's conception of player agency is too deterministic. Journey presents players with a prompt, the introduction or dissipation of melodic material, but the player must decide how to respond. Perhaps the player, like John Cage, chooses to seek out the beauty in silence and so-called white noise. Perhaps one prefers to allow each objective's music to lapse before activating the next. Certainly, this interaction is likely not the response the composer and developers intended, but what of it? By opening its world to player agency, video game meaning becomes multiple. Secondly, Grasso's account focuses too narrowly on music's impact on gameplay. What about the music's thematic, personal significance? What meanings emerge from the discovery of melody from ancient artifacts within a desolate and musically unordered environment? How might players understand the evolution and apotheosis of Journey's primary musical theme as a semiotic analog to their own life story? Such interpretations are no less part of experiencing a video game, and no less part of understanding its music. The vital element missing from Grasso's Ludo musical narrative is interpretation, playing not only with the video game's mechanics, but also its meanings. I will now propose a theory of interpretive interactivity for video game music, though it just as accurately could be termed interactive interpretation. 1. Interacting with video game music is an interpretive act, reifying a sonic vision of the game world. For video game music, play occurs not only within the game's mechanics, but also at the level of realizing its musical score. Each button press is an interpretive act that decrees how the soundscape should be for that player's ludonarrative journey, akin to decreeing, "Let this music be heard now." Interpretive interactivity also carries with it evaluative judgment. It is good for the music to take this shape now. Unlike concert or film music, players can intercept the musical flow, bending it to their desires, and doing so changes the content of the musical text. 2. Video game music shapes player understanding of both gameplay and narrative, which in turn influences player agency. Players actively seek meaning from game sound, becoming semiotic interpreters. Some deciphered meanings may be ludic, others may be narrative. Interpretive interactivity affirms that the narrative meanings heard influence gameplay decisions just as ludic meanings do. Musical narrative meaning shapes gameplay decisions in countless ways. For example, which characters players gravitate toward using, and what kind of enemies or obstacles likely populate a particular environment. In video game music, ludology and narratology are harmonized in the interpretive agency of the player. 3. Players' interpretive agency is indeterminate, personal, and plural. As an interactive medium, video games are rife with multiplicity of gameplay, of experiences, of meanings. Though this is true of semiotic interpretation generally, it carries special force when players' interpretive agency impacts the form of the text itself. Video games uniquely blur the boundary between author and audience so completely, casting players as co-creators rather than observers. Ludomusicologists must therefore embrace game music's polysemy, centering players' contributions to its meanings. The interpretive interactivity of players thus becomes intensely personal, drawing who they are as individuals into the text formation and semiosis. 4. The act of interpretation implicates real-world social, cultural, and political meanings, as it entangles the interpreter's individual identity in the game world. Interpretive interactivity is the reason the magic circle of video games can never be a closed system. Interpretation is central in communication, and so, therefore, is the interpreter, writes Günter Kress. Musical meanings transfer from the real world into game worlds because it is real-world listeners who interpret them. Because musical meaning in the game world signifies in the real world simultaneously, studying its representation of real-world communities, identities, and cultures is of paramount importance. Researching demographic representation in video game music is critical precisely because each player is a nexus between virtual and real worlds, entangling real-world social, cultural, and political meanings in the game world's magic circle. Let's conclude with a powerful case study of interpretive interactivity in action. Imagine with me, if you will, a third, previously unknown Homeric epic starring Orpheus is unearthed. Call it the Orphead. Within its verses, Orpheus returns from his sojourn in the underworld, only to discover that 10 years have passed, he is presumed dead, and no one believes he is truly Orpheus. Wandering throughout the land, Orpheus discovers a humanity torn apart by strife with each other and with nature. Only Orpheus is in harmony with the earth, enough to hear nature's song, which reveals to him that the earth is steadily dying. In the realm of the Fates, he learns that humanity's own destructive character is driving the world to destruction. Recalling the music he has gathered during his travels, Orpheus weaves together the sounds of nature and humanity into a new melody which revitalizes the land, bringing harmony between them and between warring peoples. Such a narrative would befit the themes, epic scope, and mysticism of Orphic mythos. Yet no archaeologists are necessary to excavate this text, for it already exists. The story described as the Orphead belongs to the video game Chrono Cross. The labyrinthine story of Chrono Cross showcases 4 central themes: fate, prejudice, nature, and music. In the idyllic El Nido archipelago, humanity is protected by the supercomputer Fate, which subtly influences individuals' decisions and outcomes. Surge, the game's protagonist, was determined by Fate to drown 10 years prior to the game, but was rescued by an outsider not subject to Fate. Thwarting Fate's design produced two timelines, one where Surge died and the other where he survived. The region of El Nido is riven by war and prejudice in both timelines. Nature, and humanity's treatment of it, is one of Chrono Cross's primary themes, in balance or conflict with technology. In El Nido, society relies on elements, technology that channels one of 6 forces of nature to produce various effects. Music is foregrounded multiple times in the game's narrative, suggesting its ludic and aesthetic importance to players. In Marbule, the home island of demi-humans, the song of the land has been stripped, and with it the land's power, by the enslavement of its people. Though in captivity, demi-humans sing the Song of Marbule in secret, until the musician Nikki persuades the Sage of Marbule to teach it to him, calling it a beautiful song, originating from a beautiful island. Together, the demi-humans and Nikki's band, the Magical Dreamers, perform a rock opera based on the Song of Marbule, which aesthetically rivals the famed Final Fantasy VI opera scene, foregrounding music's power to bring together communities in harmony. Another example occurs in the ruins of Chronopolis, humanity's advanced utopia experimenting with technology to control evolution and time itself. The scientists' research logs reveal an obsession with humanity becoming like God, reading, "The DNA records are poems and music, adenine and thymine, guanine and cytosine, rhythm and melody. I wonder if life forms are just dreaming in an endless flow of music." Narratively, this links the game's themes of nature and music. In Chrono Cross, music is foundational to life itself, encoded in the DNA of all creatures. This leads to the game's final level and breathtaking final scene. Terra Tower's soundscape is preceded by silence and white noise. The entryway contains the Terra Tower, guardian of the yellow element, sonically introduced by ominous cathedral bells. Lugubrious, somber string pads looping a D minor progression fade into hearing. From the Terra Tower battle onward, whenever player characters or enemies use an element, an orb of that color appears, accompanied by a bright, synthesized tone on one of 5 pitches. To be clear, players and enemies have been using elements for the entire game without either effect occurring. This phenomenon is unique to the final level, and thus highly semiotically marked. The novel sonic element cries out for interpretation. How are these sounds to be understood? A crucial part of the classically trained musician's core skill set is ear training, the ability to accurately hear and understand the music we listen to. In oral skills classes, one of the main activities cultivating ear training is melodic dictation, listening to a short melody and notating it by ear on staff paper. The student is confronted with a series of unknown pitches and must make coherent sense of them in relation to each other. Chrono Cross immerses players in an experience analogous to melodic dictation, presenting them with sounds that must be listened to and interpreted to be understood. How do they relate to each other and to the musical score? In what narrative or ludic context are the pitches relevant? In other words, to what key of gameplay do they belong? When players first hear the pitches over the D minor string progression of Terra Tower, several pitches sound out of place. While E and A fit with D minor, B, C sharp, and F sharp do not. Each of the tower's 6 guardians uses only one color of element. Terra Tower, the first guardian, uses yellow elements, sounding B pitches over the D minor chord, signaling from the start that this pitch collection pertains to another context. Approaching these newly introduced sounds from an ear training perspective attunes players to listen to and interpret them as ludically and narratively relevant. As players progress through Terra Tower, the story encourages attention to the phenomenon. The spirit of Chrono, the protagonist of Chrono Trigger, the preceding game, tells Surge, the Chrono Cross, the melody and harmony, By using it as an element, it has the power to draw on the sounds of the 6 colored elements to produce a healing harmony. It has the power to combine the sounds of the world into one melody. If players did not recognize the significance of the elements' pitches previously, they certainly will now. To make matters abundantly clear, the next new room plays the 6 pitches over white noise, rhetorically marking the sounding melody. Players must also recognize the sequence's narrative connections to the 6 elemental guardians. Since red and black elements both produce F sharp, the melody alone cannot adjudicate their order. However, realizing that the Pyrator is fought second, and the Gravitor 5th or 6th provides the answer. The elemental guardian's order matches that of the melody. By ordering the pitches, players hear them not only as tones, but as a melody. After completing Terra Tower comes the final battle, the Time Devourer, a manifestation of humanity's malice and destructive nature capable of destroying all space-time. Accompanying the Time Devourer is the Darkness of Time, consisting solely of dissonant, swirling white noise. As when the melody was heard in full, all competing pitches fall away, leaving only the exposed sounds of the elements. Like silent anticipation for the first note of a music performance, this clears the sonic stage, prompting players, what sounds will you create? Selecting elements in the order, yellow, red, green, blue, black, white, and then using the Chrono Cross, performs the melody of nature heard in Terra Tower, with the addition of one final note, D. The original 6-note loop transfers from the interactive score to the non-diegetic underscore, as lush orchestral textures join in. The violins play an elongated melody continuing the 7-note version over the quicker looping texture, climaxing as the Time Devourer dissolves into the void and all space-time is saved. Music is the foundation of this game's breathtaking ending. Chrono Cross presents a striking example of multimodal semiotic synthesis of music, narrative, and play. Musically and narratively, it encodes the significance of the element's pitches long before they become ludically important. Players must listen to the music as narratively relevant, not merely as means to a ludic end. The resolution of the 6-note B minor ostinato to D, the relative major, is semiotically significant, encoding the game's narrative meaning. Just as hearing the music of the elements as a melody frees humanity from its cycles of malice, it reinterprets C# as a modulating leading tone, lifting the melody to its relative major key. Like the hypothetical Orphead, players choose to reify a world where music makes peace between humanity and nature, and people with one another. The aesthetically compelling finale of Chrono Cross exemplifies interpretive interactivity, harmonizing ludic and narrative elements in the player's musical agency.